My parents looked me right in the eye and fed my custom wedding invitation straight into a heavy-duty paper shredder. They laughed and told me to take my fiancé to City Hall so I could hand over my wedding budget to my spoiled brother instead. They thought they were so clever putting me in my place. They had no idea that just a few months later, they would be watching me walk down a glass aisle at a $60 million Malibu estate on national television, while their own lives completely unraveled. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. My name is Blair and I am 33 years old. I stood in the immaculate kitchen of my parents' suburban home feeling the cold marble of the island beneath my fingertips. I had just placed my wedding invitation right in the center of the counter. It was a beautiful piece of thick ivory cardstock with hand-pressed gold foil lettering. It cost $50 per envelope to produce, and I had designed it myself with meticulous care. My mother Brenda did not even look at it. She was too busy scrolling through her tablet, looking at luxury furniture she could not afford. She took a sip of her sparkling water and finally glanced down at the envelope. Her lips curled into a tight sneer. She picked it up by the corner as if it was something repulsive. She told me weddings are a frivolous waste of capital. She said that a girl in my position with my limited income should not be throwing away money on a party. I tried to keep my voice steady. I told her I was paying for it myself, and that my fiancé Nolan and I just wanted her and Dad to be there to celebrate with us. Brenda laughed. It was that sharp, mocking laugh that had defined my entire childhood, making me feel small and insignificant. Without breaking eye contact, she walked over to the home office nook in the corner of the kitchen. She turned on the heavy-duty paper shredder. I watched in absolute silence as she fed my beautiful gold foil invitation directly into the machine. The loud grinding noise filled the kitchen, tearing my hard work and my olive branch into tiny pieces of trash. She brushed her hands together and walked back to the island. She looked at me and demanded that I call Nolan right now and cancel the entire event. She told me to go down to City Hall on a Tuesday morning and get it over with quietly, so I would not embarrass the family with a cheap wedding. Then she dropped the real bombshell. She said since I would be saving so much money by canceling my ridiculous party, I could finally do something useful for the family and give my wedding budget to my brother Derek. She claimed he was under so much stress with his startup company and needed the financial support much more than I needed a white dress. She spoke with such absolute conviction, completely erasing my feelings and my special day as if they did not matter at all. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of her demand, heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. My father Richard walked into the kitchen holding a thick stack of printed papers. He did not say hello. He did not congratulate me on my engagement. He simply walked right up to the island and slapped a pre-drafted legal document down on the marble counter right where my invitation had been sitting just minutes before. I looked down at the bold black letters at the top of the page. It was a formal loan agreement. Richard tapped his expensive pen against the paper and told me I needed to sign it immediately. He demanded that I transfer $60,000 to Derek by the end of the week. I stared at him completely bewildered. I asked him why on earth he thought I would give Derek $60,000. Richard puffed out his chest and spoke to me like I was a slow child. He explained that Derek and his wife Simone, a striking African-American woman with a massive social media following, were looking to buy a luxury home in Calabasas. Simone is a lifestyle influencer, and she had apparently convinced Derek that she desperately needed a massive mansion to film her daily content and build her brand image. Richard went on and on about how Derek was the golden child building the future of software with his brilliant tech startup. He told me that my little party planning hobby was nothing compared to the legacy Derek was building. My parents had always dismissed my career. To them, I was just a girl who arranged flowers and set up folding tables for local birthdays. They had absolutely no idea that I was actually the founder and CEO of an ultra-luxury event production agency catering to billionaires and corporate executives. I had spent years intentionally hiding my wealth from them, specifically to avoid moments exactly like this one. Richard leaned over the counter and pointed the pen right at my face. He told me I owed it to the family to fund my brother's lifestyle. He said that since Nolan was just a corporate lawyer, I did not need the money anyway, and I should stop being so selfish. They were openly demanding that I drain my own savings to buy a mansion for a brother who never even called me on my birthday, and a sister-in-law who treated me like the hired help. The entitlement radiating from them was so suffocating it was almost hard to breathe. Brenda chimed in, agreeing with him, saying that I had always been ungrateful, and this was my chance to finally prove my loyalty to the family and make up for my shortcomings. They stood there crossing their arms, waiting for me to break down and comply, just like I always did when I was a teenager. They expected me to pick up that pen and sign away my dignity and my money just to buy a fraction of their conditional love. I looked at the shredded pieces of my wedding invitation, overflowing from the trash bin. Then I looked at the insulting loan document sitting on the counter. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I realized in that exact moment that I owed these people absolutely nothing. Instead of picking up the pen, I slowly opened my designer purse and reached inside not for my checkbook, but for my silver lighter. I held the cool, heavy silver lighter in my right hand, feeling its smooth, metallic surface against my palm. This lighter was an antique I had picked up during a trip to Milan, a trip my parents knew nothing about because they assumed I could barely afford groceries. Richard and Brenda stood across the marble kitchen island with their arms crossed over their chests, completely confident that I was about to cave. They had spent my entire 33 years of life conditioning me to fold under their pressure. They expected the familiar cycle of my compliance. They expected me to lower my head, apologize for being selfish, and promise to transfer the $60,000 to Derek by the end of the business week. The silence in the kitchen stretched on, feeling thick and suffocating. The only sound was the low hum of the expensive stainless steel refrigerator behind them. I looked at my father, Richard, whose face was already flushed with impatience. I looked at my mother, Brenda, who was tapping her manicured fingernails against the granite countertop, clearly annoyed that I was taking so long to surrender. In the past, this exact look from them would have sent a wave of panic straight through my chest. I used to crave their approval so desperately that I would have gone into massive debt just to hear them say they were proud of me. But looking at them right now, standing over the shredded remains of my wedding invitation, I felt absolutely nothing. The fear was completely gone. The guilt they had spent decades installing in my brain simply vanished. I realized that giving them $60,000 for Derek and Simone to buy a mansion would not earn me a seat at their table. It would just make me their permanent personal ATM machine. I picked up the thick, heavy legal document my father had so arrogantly slapped onto the counter. It was 5 pages long, stapled neatly at the top corner, detailing how I would freely gift my hard-earned savings to my brother without any expectation of repayment. I held the pages up, examining the crisp black font. Then I flicked the heavy silver lighter. A bright orange flame sprang to life, cutting through the tense atmosphere of the room. My mother's eyes widened slightly, but she did not move. I slowly brought the flame to the bottom corner of the thick paper. It took a second to catch, but soon a bright edge of fire began eating away at the legal jargon. A thin trail of gray smoke drifted up toward the high ceiling, carrying the sharp, distinct smell of burning paper. The confident smirks on my parents' faces instantly melted into expressions of absolute horror. Richard took a step forward, his mouth dropping open in pure shock. He raised his hand as if he wanted to snatch the burning document away from me, but the flame was already spreading rapidly across the page, blackening the paper and curling the edges. I held it for another second, watching the fire consume the ridiculous demands they had laid out for my life. When the heat grew close to my fingers, I calmly turned away from the marble island and walked over to their deep stainless steel kitchen sink. I dropped the burning stack of papers directly down the drain. The fire continued to flicker brightly inside the dark metal basin. Brenda finally found her voice and let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutching her chest, as if I had just set the entire house on fire. Richard shouted my name, his voice echoing off the tile backsplash, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. I did not yell back. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I reached out and firmly pressed the switch for the garbage disposal. The kitchen was instantly filled with the violent, deafening roar of the grinding blades tearing through the burning paper and churning it into absolute nothingness. I let it run for a few seconds before reaching over to the faucet and turning on the cold water to wash away the ashes. I flipped the disposal off, and the kitchen fell into a stunned, breathless silence. I turned back to face them. I looked right into my father's furious eyes and spoke with a cold, steady clarity that I had never used before. I told them that the Bank of Blair was permanently closed. I told them they would never see another dime of my money, and that Derek and Simone could figure out how to finance their own luxury lifestyle. My mother started screaming. She yelled that I was a disrespectful, ungrateful daughter who was turning her back on her own flesh and blood. She screamed that I would regret this and that family was the only thing that mattered in this world. Richard joined in, threatening to cut me out of the family entirely and ban me from all future holidays. I just smiled. Their threats were empty because they had nothing left that I wanted. I picked up my designer purse, turned my back on them, and walked straight out of the kitchen. I strode quickly down the long hallway, pushing open the heavy mahogany front door and stepping out into the crisp afternoon air. The sound of their yelling was instantly muffled as the door clicked shut behind me. I took a deep breath of the fresh suburban breeze, feeling a massive, invisible weight lift completely off my shoulders. I had never felt so incredibly free. I walked down the manicured front walkway and approached the sleek black Porsche parked at the curb. My fiancé Nolan was sitting patiently in the driver's seat, looking effortlessly handsome in his tailored suit. He unlocked the doors and I slid into the passenger side, sinking into the soft leather. Nolan looked over at me, studying my expression. He could tell immediately that something fundamental had shifted. I looked over at him and told him to call his assistant and cancel the modest hometown venue we had booked for the wedding. Nolan raised an eyebrow, asking me what had happened in there. I told him my parents had shredded our invitation and tried to extort $60,000 from me. I told him we were not playing small anymore and that it was time to call the television network. Before Nolan could even respond, my phone lit up in the cup holder, buzzing violently. My screen filled with a rapid stream of furious, hateful text messages from my sister-in-law Simone, demanding to know why my parents were calling her in a panic. She called me a selfish brat and said I was ruining her brand by refusing to be a supportive sister. She promised to make my life miserable if I did not fix this immediately. I simply stared at the glowing screen. The real war was just beginning. I sat in the passenger seat of Nolan's sleek black Porsche, watching the manicured lawns of my childhood neighborhood blur past the tinted windows. My heart was still beating a little faster than usual, but my mind felt incredibly clear and focused. Nolan placed a comforting hand on my knee, silently letting me know he supported every single decision I had just made inside that toxic house. Before we reached the highway, the silence was shattered by my phone ringing loudly through the Bluetooth speakers. The caller ID flashed on the dashboard. It was Simone. My brother Derek's wife. Simone was a lifestyle influencer who built her brand around portraying a luxurious life as a sophisticated African-American woman married to a wealthy tech entrepreneur. It was all a carefully curated lie, but she protected that image with ruthless aggression. I took a deep breath and answered. I expected her to yell at me about the $60,000 I just refused to give her husband. I expected her to demand an apology for the scene I caused. Instead, her voice came through sickeningly sweet and completely detached from reality. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not mention my shredded custom wedding invitation. Simone simply bypassed all of that and launched directly into a monologue about her own life. She announced her Instagram account was about to hit 500,000 followers, and she was throwing a massive milestone celebration. She went on and on about the aesthetic she wanted, describing flower walls and champagne towers. She spoke as if she was talking to a hired assistant instead of a sister-in-law who had just been humiliated by the family. I listened to her ramble for a few moments before I finally interrupted and asked her why she was telling me all of this. Simone's fake sweet tone faltered for a fraction of a second before she smoothly recovered. She laughed a high-pitched artificial sound and told me that she wanted me to design and produce the entire event for her. She actually used the word donate. She wanted me to donate my premium event planning services, including the floral arrangements, the custom catering, and the lighting, completely free of charge. She framed it as a mutually beneficial opportunity. She claimed that letting me work on her party would give my little party business some much-needed exposure to her massive audience. She spoke with such profound arrogance, completely unaware that the clients I worked with spent more on a single corporate retreat than she made in 3 years of sponsored posts. Simone then casually pivoted back to the money. She said since I was being so difficult about handing over the $60,000 for their new Calabasas mansion, doing this party for free was the absolute least I could do to fulfill my family obligations. She told me it was my duty to support Derek's image because a successful tech founder needed a wife with a flawless social media presence. She genuinely believed my professional resources were community property for her and Derek to exploit. I looked over at Nolan, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly. He was a corporate attorney who dealt with ruthless executives all day, but even he was stunned by the sheer audacity of her demands. I turned my attention back to the call, keeping my voice perfectly flat. I told Simone that I would not be producing her milestone party. I told her I do not work for free, and I do not work for people who treat me with blatant disrespect. The moment I said the word no, the sweet influencer persona instantly vanished. Simone's real voice came through harsh and dripping with venom. She told me I was making a massive mistake. She reminded me that she had 500,000 loyal followers who listened to every single thing she said. She threatened to drag my business name through the mud on her Instagram stories. She promised to post fake reviews telling everyone that I was unprofessional, unreliable, and a nightmare to work with. She said she would make sure I never booked another client in the city again. She was attempting a full-blown extortion, trying to leverage her digital following to force me into free labor. It was completely laughable to me. The vendors and billionaires I contracted with did not care about Instagram gossip. They cared about ironclad non-disclosure agreements and flawless execution. But Simone lived in a superficial bubble where she thought angry social media posts could destroy an actual corporate empire. I did not raise my voice to match her anger. I simply told her that attempting to extort a business owner was a terrible idea, especially when she was married to a man whose startup was currently desperate for legitimate investors. I told her that any defamatory statements made against my agency would be met with an immediate and crushing defamation lawsuit filed by my fiancé's law firm. I heard her gasp over the line, clearly not expecting me to push back with legal threats. Before she could recover, I told her to have a wonderful day, and I ended the call. I reached over to the dashboard screen and permanently blocked her number. I leaned back against the leather seat and let out a long sigh. Less than 5 minutes after I blocked Simone, my phone began to vibrate wildly in my purse. I pulled it out and opened the screen. The family group chat was exploding with notifications. Simone had immediately run crying to my parents, and Derek twisting the narrative to make herself the victim. She claimed I had verbally attacked her and threatened her career just because she kindly offered to help promote my struggling business. Derek sent angry text messages calling me a jealous failure who could not stand to see anyone else succeed. Brenda chimed in, typing emotional paragraphs about how I was tearing the family apart. Richard sent aggressive messages demanding that I unblock Simone immediately and apologize for my unacceptable behavior. I sat there watching the toxic words scroll down my screen. For years, these group chat pile-ons would have sent me into a panic attack, causing me to desperately try to fix the situation. But today, I just watched the messages roll in, feeling like I was observing strangers. I did not type a single word in response. My silence only made them angrier. Their messages shifted from demanding an apology to making outright threats. Then a final message popped up from my father Richard. It sent a chill down my spine. He typed that they were done dealing with my disrespect over the phone. He said that my mother himself and Derek were getting into the car right now and driving straight to my apartment building. He declared that they were going to fix my terrible attitude in person, and I had better be ready to face them. I locked my phone screen and looked out the window. The digital smear campaign was over, and a real physical confrontation was heading directly for my front door. We pulled up to my luxury apartment building in downtown Los Angeles. The building was a sleek architectural masterpiece featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls and an exclusive concierge service. My parents had only been here once and assumed that Nolan paid for my rent. They firmly believed I was practically broke, struggling to get by on my little party planning hobby. The reality was vastly different. I actually owned the penthouse suite outright, having purchased it in cash 2 years ago after closing a massive corporate production contract. We walked through the revolving glass doors feeling exhausted, but completely united against my family. The grand lobby was usually a peaceful sanctuary filled with the soft sound of cascading water features and ambient jazz music. But today, that serene atmosphere was completely shattered. Sitting on the imported Italian leather sofas, right in the middle of the lobby, were my mother Brenda and my father Richard. They had not come alone. My brother Derek was pacing nervously near the elevator banks, constantly checking his phone. They had driven straight from the suburbs, just like they threatened to do in the family group chat. As soon as they saw us walk through the polished glass doors, my mother jumped up from the sofa. She did not casually walk toward us. She aggressively marched. She wore a look of absolute righteous fury on her face, tightly clutching her designer handbag like a weapon. Richard was right behind her, puffing out his chest and trying to look physically intimidating. The uniformed concierge behind the massive marble desk looked extremely uncomfortable, clearly unsure if he needed to call building security to escort them out. I placed a gentle, reassuring hand on Nolan's arm, signaling him to let me handle this confrontation. I fully expected them to yell at me about the destroyed wedding invitation sitting in their garbage disposal. But they had cooked up an entirely different strategy during their drive to the city. They decided they were going to play the victims in a highly public setting. Brenda stopped a few feet away from us and dramatically clasped her hands over her chest. She raised her voice intentionally, making it loud enough for the other affluent residents to hear. She proudly announced that they were staging a formal family intervention because they deeply feared for my safety. I stared at her, completely bewildered by the performance. A fake public intervention was a brand new low even for their toxic standards. Richard took a step forward and pointed a thick, angry finger directly at Nolan's chest. He loudly accused my fiancé of being a manipulative, controlling abuser. My father claimed that Nolan was actively brainwashing me, isolating me from my loving flesh and blood, and hoarding my meager savings for his own selfish purposes. He told the entire lobby that Nolan was a ruthless corporate shark taking advantage of my naive and trusting nature. Brenda immediately chimed in, squeezing out fake tears that rolled down her cheeks. She wailed that I had never been this disrespectful before Nolan came into my life. She painted this elaborate delusional picture where Nolan was a master psychological manipulator, forcing me to withhold the $60,000 from my own brother just to prove his dominance. They were using popular therapy buzzwords, trying to publicly humiliate us into submission. They honestly thought that causing a dramatic scene in my luxury apartment building would embarrass me so badly that I would surrender and write the check to make them disappear. Derek stood slightly behind my parents, trying his hardest to look like a deeply concerned older brother, but I could clearly see the greedy anticipation shining in his eyes. He actually had the absolute nerve to tell me that he forgave me for acting crazy and that he just wanted his sweet little sister back. Nolan stood perfectly still next to me, radiating calm authority. As a highly successful corporate attorney, he dealt with hostile negotiations for a living. He did not look intimidated, insulted, or embarrassed by their wild accusations. He simply looked incredibly bored by their lack of sophistication. He leaned down and whispered quietly in my ear, asking if I wanted him to handle the legal implications of this public defamation. I shook my head slightly. I did not need a brilliant lawyer to handle my toxic family anymore. I looked back at my parents, calmly observing their desperate theatrical performance. They were absolutely convinced that I was terrified of public confrontation. They genuinely thought I would crumble and beg for mercy just to save face in front of my wealthy neighbors and the building staff. When they finally realized that I was not crying, apologizing, or begging them to lower their voices, Richard decided to deliver the final crushing blow. He stepped closer, crossing his arms firmly over his chest to deliver his ultimate ultimatum. He told me that right now was my absolute last chance to do the right thing. He demanded that I take them up to my apartment, immediately pull out my checkbook, and write Derek a certified check for the full $60,000. If I refused his generous offer, he said the consequences would be severe and permanent. He threatened to officially disown me on the spot. He promised to call his lawyer and legally remove me from their will, cutting me out of what he proudly called the family legacy. Brenda loudly added that I would be permanently banned from all future family holidays, starting with the Thanksgiving dinner next month. They told me I would be completely dead to them, an orphaned outcast with absolutely no family left to turn to, when my controlling fiancé eventually dumped me. They laid out the terms of their emotional blackmail with absolute supreme confidence, waiting for me to break down. The silence in the grand lobby felt incredibly heavy as the harsh echoes of their threats finally faded. The concierge was now holding the desk phone receiver, ready to officially dial the authorities if I gave him the signal. A few residents had stopped by the brass mailroom doors to discreetly watch the family drama unfold. My parents stood there looking triumphant, believing they had just played an unbeatable winning hand. They had just offered to completely remove themselves from my life forever if I did not pay their ridiculous financial ransom. They had no idea that they were offering me the greatest gift I could have possibly imagined. I did not look at the marble floor in shame. I did not apologize for my actions. I did not even bother to defend Nolan because his impeccable reputation spoke for itself. Instead, I looked directly into their angry, demanding faces, and I felt a genuine warm smile slowly spread across my face. I reached down and calmly unlatched the gold clasp of my imported leather briefcase. I reached inside, bypassing the massive vendor contracts, and my fingers found exactly what I was looking for. I pulled out a crisp, heavy manila folder, holding it firmly in my hands, feeling the absolute weight of the brutal reality check I was about to deliver. I held the crisp manila folder in my hands, feeling the smooth texture of the paper. My parents watched me with absolute triumph shining in their eyes. They had just publicly threatened to disown me right in the middle of my luxury apartment lobby, and they were completely convinced that their toxic strategy had worked perfectly. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief and actually patted her chest as if she had just survived a terrible ordeal. Richard puffed out his chest even further, stepping forward with his hand outstretched. He just greedily reached for the folder, expecting to find a certified check for $60,000 to fund Derek's fake lifestyle. The sheer arrogance radiating from the three of them was almost suffocating, but it only fueled my confidence. I looked at Nolan, who stood perfectly still beside me, a knowing smile playing on his lips. He was the only one in the room who knew exactly what was inside that folder, because his law firm had drafted the documents for me. I took a step forward and placed the folder directly into my father's outstretched hand. I did not break eye contact. I told him that since they had just made their terms perfectly clear, I was officially delivering my response. Richard snatched the folder from my hands with a greedy swiftness that was honestly pathetic to watch. He flipped open the heavy cover, expecting to see the colorful design of a bank check. Instead, his eyes landed on a stark white sheet of thick legal paper filled with dense paragraphs and bold black headings. His smug smile instantly faltered. He blinked rapidly, staring at the page, as if the words were written in a foreign language. Brenda leaned over his shoulder, trying to get a look, her manicured fingers gripping his arm tightly. Derek stepped up next to them, his grin slowly fading as he noticed the deep confusion washing over our father's face. Richard looked up from the document, his face turning a pale shade of gray. He looked at me and asked what this was. He held the paper up his hand, actually trembling slightly. He asked why there was a legal notice with his name on it. I kept my voice perfectly level and incredibly calm. I told him that it was exactly what it looked like. It was a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I explained that it was an official legal eviction notice demanding that he and Brenda pack up all of their belongings and leave the suburban home they had been living in. The grand lobby of the apartment building went completely dead silent. Even the cascading water feature seemed to fade into the background. Brenda gasped loudly, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. She looked at me as if I had just lost my mind. She asked me how I could possibly evict them from their own house. She told me I had absolutely no legal right to do such a thing and that I was making a fool of myself. I took a long, deep breath, letting the reality of the moment sink in completely. I looked right at my mother and told her that it had not been their house for over 5 years. I watched their faces contort in absolute shock as I finally revealed the massive secret I had been keeping to protect their fragile egos. I reminded Richard about the terrible financial investments he made 5 years ago when Derek's first tech startup completely failed. I reminded him how the bank was just days away from foreclosing on the family home and leaving them with absolutely nothing. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out because he knew it was the absolute truth. I told them that the mysterious private investor who bought their mortgage at the very last second, the anonymous corporate entity that allowed them to stay in the house rent-free all these years, was not a stranger. It was me. I explained that my little party planning hobby they loved to mock had actually generated enough capital to buy their entire estate in cash. I told them I formed a private limited liability company to purchase the property specifically so they would not feel humiliated by the fact that their scapegoat daughter had to save them from total ruin. I had paid their property taxes, their insurance, and the maintenance costs for half a decade while they sat in my living room and told me I was a disappointment. I watched the realization hit them like a physical blow. Derek looked completely terrified, finally understanding that his broke sister was actually the sole financial pillar holding up the entire family facade. Brenda started shaking her head violently, refusing to accept the truth. She stammered that I was lying, and that a girl like me could never afford a house in that prestigious neighborhood. She insisted it was an elaborate bluff designed to scare them. Nolan calmly stepped forward, his voice echoing with undeniable legal authority. He informed them that the deed was fully recorded in the county database and that his firm held all the original certified documentation. He advised them that any attempt to fight the eviction would only result in public court records exposing their financial ruin to the entire community and all of their wealthy friends. Richard looked absolutely defeated. His shoulders slumped forward, and the aggressive, intimidating posture he had carried into the lobby completely vanished into thin air. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes and asked me how I could do this to my own family. He asked how I could throw my own parents out onto the street just because we had a minor disagreement over money. I felt absolutely no pity looking at him. I simply reminded him of the cruel words he had shouted at me just 5 minutes ago. I told him that he was the one who just publicly declared he was disowning me in front of strangers. I told him that he was the one who said I was no longer a part of the family legacy. I explained that since we were no longer family, according to his own aggressive terms, our relationship was now strictly a matter of landlord and tenant. And as a landlord, I had zero tolerance for tenants who verbally abused me in public spaces. I told them their 30-day countdown started right now, and that they should definitely spend less time demanding my money and more time packing up their boxes. I slowly turned my back on their stunned, silent faces and walked straight out the heavy glass doors without ever looking back once. I climbed back into the passenger seat of the waiting car, feeling incredibly powerful, completely liberated, and ready for my next move. I looked over at Nolan and smiled, feeling an amazing, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. I told Nolan to pull away from the curb and drive directly to the downtown corporate boardroom, where my true financial empire was waiting to be unleashed upon the world. The drive from my apartment to the downtown financial district took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like I was traveling between two completely different universes. Back in my luxury lobby, my parents and my brother Derek were likely still standing in absolute shock, staring at the eviction notice I had just handed them. They were probably panicking, trying to figure out how their scapegoat daughter had managed to buy the very roof over their heads. But as Nolan and I stepped out of the Porsche and walked into the soaring glass atrium of the high-rise building that housed my event production agency, I left all of their toxic panic behind me. We entered the private executive elevator and Nolan swiped his security card. The stainless steel doors slid shut and we shot up to the penthouse level. When the doors opened again, we stepped out into the bustling heart of my actual life. The reception area was a masterpiece of modern design, featuring imported Italian marble floors and massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire Los Angeles skyline. My staff moved with quiet efficiency. My lead coordinator handed me a tailored blazer and a fresh cup of artisan coffee the moment I walked past the front desk. My parents genuinely believed that I spent my days arranging cheap balloons and folding chairs for local children's birthday parties. They thought I was a financial failure who needed to be bailed out or controlled. They had absolutely no idea that I commanded a team of 50 full-time employees and managed an annual operating budget that dwarfed Derek's entire fake tech startup. I walked down the wide hallway feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that always accompanied a major business deal. Nolan walked right beside me holding his sleek leather briefcase, looking incredibly proud. We approached the massive frosted glass doors of the main executive boardroom. I took a deep breath, smoothed the lapels of my blazer, and pushed the doors open. Waiting for us around the sprawling polished walnut conference table were 5 top executives from one of the premier lifestyle television networks in the country. They were dressed in impeccably tailored suits and expensive designer dresses, radiating the kind of intense corporate energy that would have sent my father running for the hills. At the head of the table sat the senior vice president of programming, a sharp, highly respected woman who oversaw the network's most lucrative shows. She stood up immediately, extending her hand with a warm professional smile. We had been in deep negotiations for the past 6 weeks, but today was the day we were finalizing the ultimate agreement. She gestured for me to take the seat across from her, while her legal team slid a thick stack of pristine printed contracts toward Nolan. The senior vice president leaned forward and began outlining the final terms of their offer. Her network was currently producing a massive high-budget docuseries focusing on the ultra-wealthy and the hidden world of luxury event production. They had spent months scouting the country for the perfect industry expert to anchor the show, and they had chosen me. But they did not just want to film me working for my billionaire clients. They wanted the ultimate season finale. They wanted to fully fund and exclusively broadcast my own wedding to Nolan. She spoke with intense passion, describing how my wedding would be the crowning jewel of their programming schedule. She told me the network was prepared to allocate a multi-million-dollar production budget entirely dedicated to making my wedding the most spectacular event television audiences had ever seen. They would cover absolutely every single expense, from custom designer gowns to private jet transportation for the guests. In exchange, the network would retain the exclusive broadcasting rights to air the ceremony to their audience of over 10 million viewers. I sat there listening to the staggering financial numbers being discussed, and I could not help but think about the scene in my parents' kitchen just an hour earlier. My mother had looked me right in the eye and fed my beautiful wedding invitation into a paper shredder, calling my special day a frivolous waste of capital. My father had demanded that I hand over my own hard-earned savings to fund a luxury mansion for a brother who completely despised me. They had tried to make me feel small, broke, and entirely dependent on their conditional approval. And yet here I was, sitting in my own downtown boardroom, being offered a multi-million-dollar television contract to showcase the exact same wedding they had just tried to destroy. The absolute poetic justice of the situation was almost overwhelming. I looked over at Nolan, who was rapidly scanning the legal clauses with his sharp analytical eyes. After a few minutes, he looked up from the documents and gave me a firm, confident nod. He confirmed that the contract was completely bulletproof. It guaranteed me absolute creative control over the entire event and ensured that my agency would receive a massive executive producer credit. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold-plated pen resting on top of the documents. I did not hesitate for a single second. I signed my name on the dotted line, officially sealing the most lucrative and powerful deal of my entire professional career. The boardroom erupted into applause. The executives stood up, shaking my hand and congratulating me on the historic partnership. We popped a bottle of vintage champagne to celebrate the signing. The senior vice president raised her crystal glass to toast our success, but as she took a sip, her expression suddenly grew incredibly serious. She placed her glass down on the table and looked directly at me. She told me that while the budget was fully approved and the contract was signed, we still had one massive logistical hurdle to overcome before we could start production. She explained that the network executives were incredibly demanding about the visuals for the season finale. They did not just want a beautiful hotel ballroom or a standard country club. They needed a venue that was completely exclusive. They wanted a location that had never been seen on television before, somewhere completely off limits to the general public. She told me they needed a jaw-dropping architectural masterpiece to justify the multi-million-dollar budget. She admitted that their own elite location scouts had hit a brick wall because the truly extraordinary properties in California were privately owned by reclusive billionaires who flatly refused to allow camera crews onto their estates. She looked at me with a mixture of hope and anxiety, asking if my agency had any secret connections that could possibly secure the impossible venue they desperately needed. The tension in the boardroom was palpable as everyone waited for my response. Finding an ultra-exclusive private estate willing to host a massive televised wedding on just a few months' notice was considered the holy grail of event planning. It was a seemingly impossible request that could easily derail the entire production. I leaned back in my leather chair, my mind rapidly cycling through my elite client roster. Just as I opened my mouth to suggest a few potential options, the private secure line on my office desk began to ring loudly. It was a special dedicated phone line that only my highest-tier clients possessed. The entire room went silent as I reached over and picked up the receiver. I glanced down at the digital caller ID display, and a slow, confident smile spread across my face. The person calling me was not just a client. He was one of the most powerful and secretive tech billionaires in the world, and as it turned out, he owed me a massive personal favor. The private secure line on my desk continued to ring its distinct chime, cutting through the celebratory atmosphere in the boardroom. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. It was Jonathan Sterling. Jonathan was not just a billionaire tech founder, he was one of the most private and powerful men in Silicon Valley. 2 years ago, his company had hosted an incredibly high-stakes international summit that was on the verge of total collapse due to a massive logistical failure by another agency. I stepped in with less than 48 hours' notice, completely restructured the event, and saved his company from a catastrophic public relations nightmare. We had maintained a close professional relationship ever since. I greeted him warmly, and he quickly got straight to the point. He told me he had heard through his own elite network that I was officially engaged and finalizing a major broadcast deal. He said he wanted to offer me a wedding gift. He told me that his private $60 million estate in Malibu, perched high on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean, was entirely mine to use for the entire week of the wedding. I was completely stunned. Jonathan's Malibu estate was legendary. It was a modern architectural masterpiece, practically invisible from the public road, secured by high stone walls and private security details. It had never been photographed for magazines, and it had certainly never been featured on television. I quickly explained the situation to the network executives sitting across the table. When the senior vice president heard the name Jonathan Sterling and realized the location we had just secured, her eyes widened in absolute shock. The location scout, who had been agonizing over finding an exclusive venue, looked like he might faint from relief. We immediately put Jonathan on speakerphone, and within 10 minutes, the logistics were firmly established. The network agreed to handle all the legal liability insurance and production costs, while Jonathan graciously waived all rental fees simply as a gesture of gratitude for my past work. With the venue locked in, the creative energy in the room completely exploded. My lead production designer began sketching out the massive vision for the ceremony right there on the whiteboard. The estate featured a stunning Olympic-sized infinity pool that appeared to drop straight off the cliff into the ocean. The network wanted to construct a completely transparent custom glass aisle directly over the water, so it would look like I was literally walking on the surface of the pool as the sun set over the Pacific. They mapped out the floral arrangements, planning to fly in thousands of rare white orchids from overseas to cascade down the glass modern architecture of the house. The catering would be handled by a 3-Michelin star chef who specialized in elevated coastal cuisine, ensuring that the billionaire guests and Hollywood elite would be properly impressed. The scale of the event was absolutely staggering, representing the absolute pinnacle of luxury event production. It was everything my parents had told me I could never achieve. As the meeting wrapped up and the network team packed their briefcases, Nolan and I walked back to my private office. I sank into my leather chair, feeling an incredible rush of excitement and validation. Everything was finally falling into place perfectly. I had secured the ultimate venue, locked in a multi-million-dollar broadcast deal, and successfully established a massive legal boundary against my toxic family by serving them an eviction notice. For the first time in my life, I felt completely untouchable. But while I was sitting in my downtown penthouse office, planning a wedding that would rival royalty, my brother Derek was back in the suburbs, sitting in the house he was about to be evicted from, letting his paranoia consume him. Derek was panicking. He had spent the last 2 hours pacing the living room floor while our parents argued about how to fight my eviction notice. Derek's tech startup was entirely fake, built on lies and borrowed money, and he desperately needed that $60,000 to keep up his wealthy facade. He simply could not comprehend how I, the sister he had always considered a complete failure, could possibly have enough money to buy their house in cash. It completely shattered his fragile ego, and he became obsessed with figuring out my secret. He convinced himself that Nolan and I must be running some kind of massive financial scam, and he decided he was going to expose us to save his own reputation. Derek sat down at his computer and began aggressively snooping through my digital footprint. He was not a real software developer, but he knew enough about basic cybersecurity to dig up old information. He managed to log into an old shared family cloud account that I had not used since college. He frantically searched through years of old photographs and digital receipts, hoping to find some piece of evidence he could use against me. He spent hours scrolling until he finally stumbled across a calendar synchronization feature that I had accidentally left active on an old tablet I left at the house years ago. The calendar was highly encrypted, but he managed to see the location tags for my upcoming appointments. He saw a massive block of time reserved for the week of my wedding, and the location simply read, Malibu Beach. Derek stared at the screen, a slow, arrogant smile creeping across his face. In his mind, Malibu Beach meant a public state park. He assumed I was having a cheap, tacky wedding on the public sand because I was actually broke, and the eviction notice was just a desperate bluff to avoid giving him the money. He had absolutely no idea that Malibu Beach was just the generalized tag for Jonathan's ultra-secure $60 million private estate. Derek's desperate need to feel superior completely blinded him to reality, setting him on a path of absolute self-destruction. He pulled out his phone and opened his social media apps, ready to launch a massive public attack. Derek sat on the edge of his childhood bed, staring at the stark white eviction notice resting on his lap. The reality of losing the house was completely terrifying, but his arrogant mind simply refused to accept it. He convinced himself that I was bluffing. He told himself there was absolutely no way his little sister, the girl he had relentlessly mocked for years, had actually bought this massive suburban house in cash. He decided that Nolan must have printed the fake legal document off the internet just to scare them. Driven by pure panic and a desperate need to protect his fragile ego, Derek decided he needed hard proof of my financial failure. He began frantically searching through every piece of digital history he could access. He dug an old family tablet out of a dusty hallway closet. He plugged it in and bypassed the outdated security lock, hoping to find a bank statement or an unpaid bill that would expose my supposed lies. Instead of finding my bank records, he stumbled across a synced calendar application that I had forgotten to disconnect years ago. His eyes darted across the glowing screen until he spotted a blocked-out week in my schedule labeled with my wedding dates. Next to the dates was a simple location tag that just read, Malibu Beach. Derek let out a loud, sharp bark of laughter. In his narrow, superficial mind, Malibu Beach did not mean a private $60 million architectural masterpiece secured by armed guards. To him, it meant the public state beach. He immediately pictured me standing on the dirty public sand right next to a rusty lifeguard tower, fighting with tourists for a parking spot, and holding a cheap plastic bouquet. He imagined me serving soggy sandwiches from a cooler to a handful of guests while seagulls circled overhead. He felt an overwhelming rush of smug satisfaction. He was completely convinced that I was absolutely broke and that my entire successful agency was nothing but a pathetic delusion. Derek did not just want to keep this imaginary victory to himself. He wanted to weaponize it against me. His fake tech startup was hemorrhaging money, and he desperately needed to maintain his image as a ruthless, successful entrepreneur to string his remaining investors along. He went back to his bedroom and set up his expensive ring light. He put on a crisp designer shirt he bought on credit and hit record on his phone. He filmed a highly produced TikTok video specifically designed to go viral. He looked directly into the camera, playing the role of the exhausted but brilliant tech founder. He told his followers about the harsh realities of the daily grind and the tragic burden of having toxic, unsuccessful family members who try to drag you down. He did not say my name, but he gave enough specific details that anyone who knew us would instantly recognize who he was talking about. He openly mocked my upcoming wedding, telling his audience that his sister was so broke she was getting married on a public beach surrounded by strangers in bathing suits. He used my supposed financial ruin as a dark cautionary tale, boasting about how he was destined for greatness, while I was doomed to a life of embarrassing poverty. While Derek was performing for his internet audience, his wife Simone was launching her own aggressive attack behind the scenes. Simone was terrified that my eviction notice would expose their fake wealth to her country club friends. She immediately started working the phones, calling every single person in our extended social circle. She poured herself a glass of wine and spent hours spinning a massive web of vicious rumors. She told everyone that Nolan was not a highly successful corporate attorney at all. She claimed he was just a low-level paralegal drowning in massive credit card debt who lied about his credentials to impress me. She whispered that the two of us were running a pathetic scam trying to steal my parents' house because we were secretly getting evicted from our own apartment. She played the victim perfectly, pretending to be deeply concerned for my mental health while systematically trying to destroy my professional reputation. She told her influencer friends that they should pity me because my public beach wedding was going to be the ultimate embarrassment. Within 24 hours, Derek's TikTok video had racked up tens of thousands of views. The algorithm pushed it out to local networks, and soon the video and Simone's nasty rumors made their way back to my phone. I was sitting on the velvet sofa in my penthouse apartment with Nolan when my lead coordinator sent me the link to the video. I tapped the screen and watched my brother perform his fake CEO routine. I listened to him mock the public beach wedding he had completely fabricated in his own head. For a brief second, a wave of familiar childhood anger washed over me. I felt the urge to immediately call him and scream into the phone. I wanted to send him the official blueprints of the $60 million billionaire estate and shatter his arrogant illusion right then and there. I wanted to watch him choke on his own words and realize how incredibly wrong he was about everything. But before I could dial his number, Nolan gently placed his hand over mine. He was watching the video with a calm, calculated smile on his face. He told me to stop and think about the strategic advantage we had just been handed. As a corporate lawyer, Nolan understood the absolute power of misdirection. He pointed out that Derek's massive ego had just created the perfect cover story for our television production. As long as my family and their toxic friends firmly believed that I was broke and getting married on a public beach, they would not come looking for the real venue. They would not hire private investigators or try to sabotage the vendor contracts because they thought there was nothing valuable to destroy. Their complete underestimation was the ultimate shield protecting our multi-million-dollar project from their chaotic interference. I looked at Nolan and realized he was absolutely right. If we corrected Derek now, they would realize I was wealthy and they would double down on their harassment. They would find out about the television network deal and try to crash the production to get themselves on camera. By letting them believe their own ridiculous lies, we were keeping them completely in the dark. I locked my phone and smiled, feeling a deep sense of strategic satisfaction. We decided right then and there to let them dig their own graves. We would let Derek continue to boast on TikTok. We would let Simone spread her pathetic rumors. We were going to use their overwhelming arrogance to set a massive legal trap that they would never see coming. Nolan opened his laptop and immediately began drafting the ironclad non-disclosure agreements for our real guests, ensuring that not a single word of the truth would leak out before the live television broadcast. We were going to let them build their entire reality on a foundation of lies, and then we were going to pull the floor out from under them on national television. Nolan sat at the massive oak desk in our penthouse home office. The soft glow of his laptop screen illuminated his face as he rapidly typed out the legal framework that would protect our entire wedding broadcast. We were not just planning a party anymore. We were orchestrating a multi-million-dollar television production featuring some of the most powerful and recognizable people in the country. The guest list included billionaire tech founders, A-list, Hollywood actors, and top-tier corporate executives. These were people who valued their privacy above absolutely everything else. They were only agreeing to attend and be filmed because they trusted me implicitly. Nolan was drafting bulletproof non-disclosure agreements for every single person who would step foot on the Malibu estate. The contracts were incredibly strict. Any vendor guest or staff member who leaked a single photograph or detail to the press before the broadcast aired would face an immediate lawsuit for millions of dollars. Nolan did not play games when it came to corporate law. He crafted clauses that covered everything from drone airspace restrictions to social media embargoes. While Nolan was securing the legal perimeter, I realized we had a glaring vulnerability right in my own family. Derek and Simone were already spinning their pathetic narrative about me having a cheap public beach wedding. My mother Brenda was incredibly nosy, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she started digging for more information. She would call local vendors trying to find out where I was registered so she could continue to mock my financial status. If she accidentally stumbled across the real wedding details or saw a vendor contract, the entire surprise would be ruined. They would instantly realize I was wealthy and they would absolutely try to crash the private estate to get themselves on television. I needed to give them a shiny object to distract them. I needed to feed their massive egos and completely validate their false reality. I opened my laptop and went to the website of a massive national discount retail chain. I created a brand new wedding registry under my name and Nolan's name. I spent the next hour intentionally selecting the cheapest, most basic household items I could possibly find. I added a plastic $20 toaster. I selected a set of thin, rough cotton bath towels. I chose a basic plastic blender and a cheap set of flatware. I even added a small microwave and a cheap vacuum cleaner. It was the exact type of registry a young broke couple struggling to make ends meet would create. In reality, Nolan and I already owned everything we could ever need, and we were actually asking our real guests to simply make donations to a pediatric cancer charity. But this fake registry was not about getting gifts. It was a carefully constructed psychological trap designed specifically for my toxic family. Once the fake registry was complete, I needed to make sure my mother found it without making it look obvious. I took a screenshot of the registry link and sent a casual text message to my Aunt Susan. Susan was my mother's sister, and she was the biggest gossip in the entire extended family. I knew with absolute certainty that if I sent the link to Susan, it would be in my mother's hands within 5 minutes. I told Susan that Nolan and I were keeping things very small and modest, and I just wanted to share the registry in case anyone asked. I hit send and set my phone down on the kitchen counter. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and waited. It did not take long. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a notification from the family group chat. Brenda had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. She took a screenshot of my discount registry and posted it directly into the family group chat for everyone to see. She followed it up with a long paragraph of cruel, mocking commentary. She typed out how deeply embarrassed she was for me. She pointed out the $20 plastic toaster and asked if I was really that desperate for cheap appliances. Derek immediately chimed in, sending a string of laughing emojis. He joked that since I could not afford my own blender, he might just buy it for me out of pity. Simone, of course, had to add her own venom. She sent a message saying that her influencer brand simply could not be associated with someone who registered for cheap cotton towels. She actually posted the link to her private Facebook page, making a passive-aggressive status update about how sad it is when family members refuse to work hard and end up begging for cheap household goods. I sat on my velvet sofa watching their cruel messages pour in, and I could not stop smiling. They were so incredibly predictable. They were so desperate to feel superior that they did not question the registry for a single second. They completely bought into the illusion that I was a financial failure living on the edge of poverty. Every single laughing emoji they sent, every single snide remark they posted, only cemented their own ignorance. By mocking my fake registry, they were actively protecting my $60 million secret. They were building a massive wall of arrogance around themselves, completely blind to the absolute media storm that was about to hit them. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully pushed me down to the bottom of the family hierarchy. But while they were busy laughing at a $20 toaster, the reality of Derek's fake tech empire was rapidly catching up to them. Derek's startup was completely out of capital. His major investors had demanded an audit, and he was just weeks away from missing payroll. The $60,000 they tried to extort from me was supposed to be a desperate band-aid to keep his fraudulent company afloat just a little bit longer. Without my money, Derek was panicking, and his panic was completely infecting my father. Richard had always tied his entire sense of self-worth to Derek's supposed success. Richard could not bear the thought of his golden child failing and exposing the family as frauds to their wealthy suburban neighbors. The pressure was mounting, and the walls were closing in on them. They had spent all their energy trying to destroy my modest life, completely unaware that their own financial foundation was crumbling into dust. Later that night, as Nolan finalized the last non-disclosure agreement, my father made a terrible decision. Richard was sitting alone in his home office, the very same office where my mother had shredded my wedding invitation. He was staring at a stack of past due notices and aggressive letters from Derek's creditors. He needed cash immediately, and he knew he could not get a traditional loan because his credit was already stretched to the absolute limit. In his desperate, frantic mind, he remembered an old joint college checking account that he had opened with me over a decade ago. It was an account I had not used or even thought about since I was 19 years old, but my name and my impeccable social security number were still technically attached to it. Richard convinced himself that since I was his daughter, he had every right to use my financial identity to save his son. He began typing out an application for a massive high-interest commercial business loan, fully intending to forge my signature and commit federal wire fraud just to keep Derek's pathetic lie alive. He filled out the digital forms with reckless speed, inputting my personal information as the primary guarantor. He justified this criminal act in his own mind by telling himself that he was protecting the family legacy. He genuinely believed that once Derek's fake app magically became successful, they could quietly pay off the fraudulent loan, and I would never even know about it. He completely ignored the reality that forging a signature on a commercial loan document was a serious felony. Richard clicked the submit button on the bank application, feeling a brief wave of relief wash over his panicked mind. He had absolutely no idea that my entire financial portfolio, including that dormant college account, was actively monitored by Nolan's elite corporate wealth management team. The moment Richard hit submit to execute his illegal scheme, he triggered a massive automated fraud alert that would bring the full terrifying weight of the law crashing down directly onto his head. The trap was set, and my father had just walked right into it. The clock was ticking, and my father Richard could feel the walls of his carefully constructed reality closing in on him. He sat alone in his dark home office, the only light coming from the glowing screen of his computer monitor. Scattered across his heavy mahogany desk were dozens of past due notices, aggressive letters from creditors, and final warning statements from Derek's supposed investors. The fake tech startup that Derek had built was not just failing, it was completely hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. Derek had lied to everyone about his active user numbers and his projected revenue streams, and now the people who gave him seed money were demanding a full forensic financial audit. Richard knew that if that audit happened, Derek's fraudulent empire would collapse overnight, and the entire family would be exposed as absolute frauds to their wealthy country club friends. The thought of losing his social status and being the subject of neighborhood gossip was a fate worse than death for a narcissist like my father. He needed a massive injection of cash immediately to cover Derek's shortfalls and keep the angry investors quiet just a little bit longer. But Richard's own credit score was completely ruined. He had secretly remortgaged the house years ago before I bought it out from under him, and his credit cards were completely maxed out from funding my mother Brenda's luxury shopping habits. He was completely trapped in a financial prison of his own making, with absolutely no legitimate way out. As Richard stared blankly at the threatening letters, a desperate and incredibly dangerous idea began to form in his mind. He stood up and began digging frantically through his old metal filing cabinets, pulling out dusty folders from over a decade ago. He tossed papers onto the floor until he found exactly what he was looking for in a faded yellow folder labeled College Expenses. When I was 18 years old and heading off to my freshman year of university, Richard had insisted on opening a joint checking account with me at a major national bank. He claimed it was so he could send me emergency funds for textbooks and groceries while I was away from home. Of course, he never actually put a single dime into that account. I ended up working 3 part-time jobs just to pay for my own meals and rent. Over the years, I simply stopped using the account entirely and eventually forgot it even existed. I assumed the bank had closed it due to inactivity, but because it was tied to my permanent Social Security number, the account remained technically open, just lying dormant in the banking system. Richard stared at the old printed bank statement, and a twisted, desperate smile crept across his face. He knew that I had built a highly successful business, and he correctly assumed that my personal credit score was absolutely flawless. In his arrogant and panicking mind, Richard completely justified the terrible crime he was about to commit. He told himself that I was an ungrateful daughter who owed him this financial support anyway. He convinced himself that because he was the patriarch of the family, he had every fundamental right to leverage my financial identity to protect the family legacy. He sat back down at his computer and opened the website for a massive national commercial bank. He began filling out an online application for a high-risk, high-interest business loan for $150,000. When the digital form asked for the primary guarantor, Richard did not hesitate for a single second. He typed in my full legal name, my current address, and my highly protected Social Security number. He listed his own contact information and Derek's failing software startup as the primary beneficiary of the funds. He moved through the application pages with reckless speed, completely ignoring the bold legal warnings about fraud and identity theft at the bottom of each screen. He was committing textbook federal wire fraud, but he simply did not care. He firmly believed that Derek's fake app would magically turn a massive profit next month, and they could quietly pay the loan back before I ever found out what he had done. He checked the final box, claiming under penalty of perjury that he was legally authorized to sign on my behalf, and he clicked the submit button. Richard let out a long, heavy sigh of relief as the confirmation screen loaded on his monitor. He leaned back in his leather chair, genuinely believing he had just saved the day. He thought he had outsmarted the banking system and secured the cash Derek desperately needed to keep playing the role of a wealthy tech founder. He had absolutely no idea about the massive invisible security net I had placed around my entire financial portfolio. Because I dealt with multi-million-dollar corporate production budgets and wealthy elite clients, my personal and business finances were actively managed by a top-tier wealth management firm. Nolan had introduced me to his senior financial advisors years ago, and they had locked down my credit with maximum security protocols specifically to prevent corporate espionage and identity theft. The absolute second Richard clicked that submit button, his massive commercial loan application triggered a highly sensitive automated fraud alert deep within the bank's mainframe. The security algorithms instantly recognized that the Internet Protocol address applying for the loan did not match my secure downtown penthouse location. They also flagged the fact that a completely dormant joint account from over 10 years ago was suddenly being leveraged for a massive commercial payout tied to an unverified tech startup. I was sitting in my penthouse living room, going over custom floral arrangements with my lead production designer, when my phone suddenly emitted a loud, piercing alarm sound. It was not a normal text message chime or a calendar reminder. It was a high-priority emergency alert directly from my wealth management team. I picked up the phone and looked at the glowing screen. My heart skipped a beat when I read the urgent notification detailing a highly suspicious and potentially fraudulent application for a $150,000 commercial business loan using my personal Social Security number. The detailed alert clearly displayed the origin of the application, pointing directly to my father's home address and listing Derek's shell company as the recipient of the funds. I stood up from the velvet sofa, my hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from absolute boiling anger. I had always known my father was a manipulative and toxic narcissist who only cared about money and his own public image. I knew he was perfectly capable of emotional abuse and psychological manipulation to get his way, but I never in a million years thought he would be stupid and desperate enough to commit actual federal identity theft against his own daughter. I politely excused myself from the design meeting and walked straight down the hallway into the home office, where Nolan was finishing up the final non-disclosure agreements for our wedding broadcast. I did not say a single word as I approached his heavy oak desk. I simply walked over and placed my phone face up right in front of his keyboard. Nolan looked down at the screen and his calm, relaxed demeanor instantly vanished. His jaw clenched tightly, and his eyes turned incredibly cold and sharp. He read the specific details of the fraudulent loan application and let out a low, humorless laugh. He pushed his chair back from the desk, looked up at me, and asked a very simple question. He asked if I wanted to handle this situation as a forgiving daughter or if I wanted to handle it as his corporate client. I looked right back into his eyes and told him that the man who submitted that loan application was not my father anymore. He was just a desperate criminal trying to steal my hard-earned future to fund a lie. I told Nolan to handle it as my legal counsel and to show absolutely zero mercy. Nolan nodded slowly, a dangerous smile forming on his lips as he picked up his own phone. He did not dial the local police department. He dialed the direct private number for the senior corporate fraud investigator at the National Bank. The trap my father had so arrogantly walked right into was about to snap shut with devastating legal force, and Richard was entirely unprepared for the crushing blow that was coming his way. Nolan did not waste a single second. When a senior partner at a top-tier corporate law firm makes a direct phone call to a national bank fraud investigator, things happen with terrifying speed. I sat on my velvet sofa listening to Nolan speak in that cold, authoritative voice he reserved for ruthless boardroom negotiations. He detailed the exact nature of the fraudulent loan application my father had just submitted. The bank investigator was absolutely horrified. Identity theft involving a $150,000 commercial loan was not a simple misunderstanding. It was a major federal crime with severe mandatory penalties. Within an hour, the bank's legal department had officially flagged the application and locked down the compromised joint account. But Nolan was not finished. He called his own firm and assembled a dedicated team of junior associates to work through the night. They were drafting a devastating cease and desist order, completely tailored to crush any further illegal attempts by my father. Watching Nolan mobilize his entire corporate legal arsenal just to protect me filled my heart with an overwhelming sense of safety and profound validation. For my entire life, my parents had made me feel completely unprotected and vulnerable. They always made me feel like I had to fend for myself against their constant selfish demands. Now, I had a literal legal fortress built around me protecting my hard-earned empire. The very next morning, the harsh reality of his criminal actions came crashing down onto my father. Richard was sitting at his kitchen island drinking his morning coffee, completely oblivious to the massive legal storm heading his way. He probably thought the fraudulent loan application was still processing normally. He genuinely believed that he would soon be a hero to his golden child, Derek. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed loudly through the suburban house. Richard casually opened the door, expecting a late package delivery or perhaps a friendly neighbor. Instead, he found a large, imposing man in a sharp gray suit holding a thick, sealed manila envelope. The man asked to officially confirm his identity. When my father proudly stated his name, the man firmly pressed the heavy envelope right into his chest and loudly announced that he had been officially served. The professional process server turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing on the front porch completely bewildered. He carried the heavy envelope back into the kitchen and tore it open with nervous fingers. Brenda walked into the room just in time to see the color completely drain from her husband's face. His hands began to shake violently as he read the bold black letterhead from Nolan's elite law firm. The document trembling in Richard's hands was not just a polite warning. It was a comprehensive legal execution designed to completely neutralize him. The cease and desist order detailed the exact timestamps and the specific internet protocol addresses used to submit the fraudulent commercial loan application. It stated in absolute uncompromising terms that Richard had committed textbook federal wire fraud and severe identity theft. The document explicitly warned that if he ever attempted to use my name, my social security number, or any of my financial information ever again, Nolan's firm would completely bypass civil court. They would immediately hand the entire forensic dossier over to federal prosecutors and push for maximum prison sentences. The threat of absolute public ruin was spelled out in incredibly clear language. But the legal document was only the beginning of his waking nightmare. Because Nolan had directly coordinated with the National Bank Fraud Department, the financial institution took immediate protective action against my father. They did not just deny the fraudulent commercial loan, they completely froze every single legitimate account associated with Richard's social security number to conduct a full internal fraud investigation. His personal checking accounts, his meager retirement savings, and his maxed-out credit cards were instantly locked down. His already fragile credit score plummeted into the absolute abyss, paralyzing his financial existence completely. He could not even buy a gallon of milk. The catastrophic consequences did not stop with my father. Because Richard had explicitly listed Derek's failing tech startup as the primary beneficiary of the stolen funds, the bank's anti-money laundering algorithms automatically flagged Derek's business entities as well. Derek was sitting in his rented co-working space, desperately trying to pitch his fake software app to a group of minor local investors when his own phone began to blow up with urgent automated banking alerts. His corporate bank accounts were instantly frozen pending a massive federal fraud review. Any remaining capital he had left to pay his server hosting fees was locked away behind an impenetrable wall of banking security. Furthermore, the severe fraud flag on his business profile was immediately shared across national financial networks. This action permanently paralyzed his ability to secure any legitimate seed funding from any reputable investor in the entire country. Word travels fast in the venture capital community, and nobody touches a founder tied to a federal wire fraud investigation. In his arrogant, misguided attempt to save his golden child, my father had effectively delivered the final lethal blow to Derek's crumbling empire. They were both completely cut off from the financial world, entirely paralyzed by the direct consequences of their own toxic greed. Back in the suburbs, Simone was busy filming her daily morning skincare routine for her 500,000 followers, completely unaware that her luxurious lifestyle was currently burning to the ground. She finished recording her video and walked downstairs, expecting to find Derek preparing for a successful day of executive meetings. Instead, she found him sitting on the living room floor, clutching his phone while he stared blankly at the wall. Derek finally broke down and confessed absolutely everything. He told her about my 30-day eviction notice, the frozen bank accounts, and his father's disastrous criminal attempt at federal fraud. Simone stared at her husband in absolute unblinking horror. The wealthy tech founder facade she had so eagerly married him for was completely shattered into a million pieces. She realized in that terrifying moment that Derek had absolutely no money. My parents were completely broke, and the entire family was facing potential federal criminal charges. Her lucrative influencer brand was built entirely on portraying extreme wealth and sophistication. If the internet found out she was married to a broke fraudster under active federal investigation, her valuable brand sponsorships would vanish overnight. Absolute panic set in, but Simone was nothing if not a ruthless survivor. She realized that there was only one person left in the entire family who had actual, undeniable wealth and power. She knew that I held all the cards. Simone decided she needed to save herself before the ship completely sank to the bottom of the ocean. She grabbed her expensive designer purse, marched straight out the front door, and decided to track me down in person, hoping she could manipulate me one last time. Simone sat at her expensive mirrored vanity table, staring at her glowing phone screen in absolute disbelief. Her morning had started like any other perfectly curated day for a lifestyle influencer, but it quickly spiraled into a complete and utter nightmare. She had tried to pay the final deposit for her massive upcoming milestone party, but her premium metallic credit card was instantly declined. Assuming it was a simple bank error, she logged into her mobile banking application and was immediately greeted by a terrifying wall of bright red security messages. Every single account attached to her husband Derek was completely frozen. Panicking, she stormed into their modern living room and demanded immediate answers from Derek. He was sitting on the edge of the couch looking like a completely broken man. The arrogant tech founder persona had completely vanished. He finally confessed the entire pathetic truth to her. He admitted that his software startup had never made a single dime of actual profit. He confessed that his primary investors were currently demanding a full forensic audit and that his father Richard had just triggered a massive federal fraud investigation by attempting to secure a desperate commercial loan using my identity. Simone felt the floor completely drop out from under her feet. Her entire digital empire, her lucrative brand sponsorships, and her carefully crafted image as a wealthy, sophisticated African-American woman married to a wildly successful entrepreneur were all built on a massive, fragile foundation of lies. If the internet found out she was broke and married to a federal criminal, her career would be over in a matter of seconds. She realized with a sinking heart that I was the absolute only person in the entire family who had any actual legitimate wealth left to save her. Simone did not care about the terrible things she had said to me just a few days prior in the family group chat. She was a ruthless survivor, and she was incredibly desperate. She somehow managed to track my location through a mutual acquaintance and drove her leased luxury vehicle straight to the heart of Beverly Hills. I was standing inside an ultra-exclusive bridal boutique standing tall on a velvet pedestal surrounded by towering gilded mirrors. The entire boutique was completely closed to the general public for my private fitting, ensuring absolute privacy. I was wearing a breathtaking custom designer gown made of imported French lace and heavy silk that cost exactly $40,000. The intricate beading sparkled under the warm chandelier light. My lead coordinator and the boutique owner were carefully pinning the sweeping cathedral train when the heavy glass front doors suddenly burst open. Simone marched into the serene, quiet environment, looking completely frantic and entirely out of place. Her usually flawless makeup was slightly smudged, and her designer clothes looked rumpled from her panicked drive across the city. The boutique security guard immediately stepped forward to intercept her, but I simply raised my hand and told him it was fine. I wanted to hear exactly what she had to say. Simone walked right up to the edge of the velvet pedestal, looking up at me in my magnificent gown. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the sheer opulence of the dress and the private Beverly Hills boutique, completely contradicting the cheap public beach narrative she had been aggressively spreading online. But she pushed her shock aside and immediately launched into her highly manipulative performance. She completely dropped her arrogant influencer persona and tried to play the role of a desperate, helpless victim. She looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes and tried to play the ultimate sisterhood card. She told me that we as women needed to stick together against the toxic men in our family who were destroying our lives. She entirely blamed Derek and Richard for the complete financial mess, claiming she had absolutely no idea that they were lying to everyone about the startup. She begged me to forgive her for her past behavior, saying she was just under so much intense pressure trying to maintain her business in a difficult, highly competitive industry. She pleaded with me to write her a personal check for $60,000 so she could pay off her immediate vendor debts and keep her influencer brand from completely collapsing before the federal investigation became public knowledge. She actually had the absolute nerve to tell me that I owed it to her, as a sister, to save her from public humiliation and financial ruin. I stood perfectly still on the velvet pedestal looking down at her frantic tear-stained face. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sympathy. I knew exactly who Simone was, and I knew she was only apologizing because she had finally run out of other people's money. I calmly asked my assistant to hand me the sleek leather portfolio resting on the nearby velvet sofa. I opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of printed high-quality paper. It was a comprehensive, detailed dossier of every single toxic action she had taken against me over the past week. I looked right into Simone's desperate eyes and began summarizing the undeniable contents of the folder. I reminded her of the cruel, demanding text messages she sent attempting to extort free event production labor for her milestone party. I mentioned the vicious coordinated smear campaign she launched in our extended social circles, spreading disgusting lies about Nolan being a broke paralegal drowning in credit card debt. I even brought up the hateful, passive-aggressive comments she posted online, mocking my fake discount wedding registry just 24 hours ago. I told her that a woman who actively tries to destroy another woman's professional reputation does not get to suddenly invoke the sacred bonds of sisterhood just because her husband committed federal fraud. Simone stood there completely frozen as her own cruel, calculating words were thrown right back into her face. She tried to stammer out a pathetic excuse, claiming she did not mean any of it and that she was just acting out of blind loyalty to Derek. I slowly shook my head and told her that her loyalty was incredibly expensive and completely worthless to me. I told her in a voice as cold as absolute ice that I would not give her a single dime to save her fake digital empire. I told her she was going to have to face the real world and pay for her own mistakes just like everyone else. I handed the dossier back to my assistant and turned my attention back to the massive mirrors surrounding me. I completely dismissed Simone from my presence, admiring the flawless fit of my $40,000 gown while she stood there entirely humiliated and defeated. I told her the fitting was a private, secure event and asked the security guard to kindly escort her out of the boutique immediately. Simone was forcibly walked out of the luxury store, her face burning with absolute shame and boiling vindictive rage. She realized that her manipulation tactics and fake tears were completely useless against my established boundaries. She got back into her car, but she did not go home to her ruined husband. Instead, her sheer panic morphed into a deep, dark hatred. She drove straight to the suburbs, pulling up to the house my parents were currently being evicted from. She stormed into the kitchen where Brenda and Richard were sitting in a state of absolute despair over their frozen bank accounts. Simone slammed her hands on the kitchen table and told them everything about my $40,000 dress and the private Beverly Hills boutique. The sudden realization that I was truly wealthy and completely untouchable pushed my toxic family over the absolute edge of sanity. They realized they could no longer steal my money or control my life, so they decided they were going to completely destroy my happiness instead. Sitting around that kitchen table, the three of them began actively plotting the ultimate retaliatory event. They decided they were going to host a massive, spiteful family gathering on the exact same night as my wedding, designed specifically to alienate me from the rest of the relatives and ruin my reputation permanently. They were preparing to burn the entire family bridge to the ground, and I was more than ready to let them strike the match. After my sister-in-law Simone was escorted out of the Beverly Hills bridal boutique, the reality of my absolute independence finally crashed down on my toxic family. But instead of feeling remorse or taking responsibility for their federal crimes and financial ruin, my parents, Brenda and Richard, chose the path of pure delusional spite. They were cornered animals bleeding money and facing severe legal consequences, but their massive narcissistic egos simply refused to let them surrender. They decided that if they could not control my bank accounts, they were going to completely destroy my reputation among our extended relatives. They needed a stage to perform their victim routine, and they needed to establish their dominance one last time. So my mother hatched a brilliantly wicked plan. She decided to host a massive formal gathering at the suburban house, the very same house they were legally being evicted from in just a few short weeks. She ironically named it a family healing dinner. But the most malicious part of her plan was the timing. She intentionally scheduled this dinner for a Saturday night at the exact same time I was scheduled to walk down the aisle. She wanted to force our entire extended family to choose a side, ensuring that absolutely no one would attend my wedding. Brenda spent the entire week leading up to the weekend aggressively working the phones. She called every single aunt, uncle, cousin, and family friend she could think of. She put on her best tearful voice and spun a massive web of incredibly vicious lies. She told everyone that Nolan and I had suffered a complete mental breakdown. She claimed that I was completely broke and that my business had failed, forcing me to throw together a pathetic, cheap wedding on a dirty public beach. She told our relatives that I was so deeply ashamed of my financial failure that I had completely cut off the family out of pure spite and jealousy. She framed the dinner not as a boycott of my wedding, but as a necessary support group for the family to heal from the emotional trauma I had supposedly caused them. My relatives, who were completely unaware of the actual truth or the federal fraud investigation, naturally believed the matriarch of the family. They RSVP'd to the dinner, completely abandoning me on what was supposed to be the most important day of my life. Brenda was absolutely thrilled. She truly believed she had won the ultimate social victory, leaving me completely isolated and alone on the beach. When Saturday evening finally arrived, the suburban house was packed with dozens of extended relatives. The driveway was overflowing with cars. Inside the house, my parents were putting on the performance of a lifetime. Despite the fact that all of their credit cards and bank accounts were completely frozen by federal fraud investigators, Brenda had somehow managed to scrape together enough cash to host the party. She bought the cheapest bulk food she could find and disguised it as a rustic family-style buffet. She poured cheap wine into crystal decanters to maintain the illusion of their wealthy suburban lifestyle. Simone was there too, playing the role of the devoted, supportive wife. She wore a bright, forced smile, completely hiding the fact that her digital influencer empire was rapidly crumbling behind the scenes. She mingled with the aunts and uncles, subtly reinforcing the terrible rumors about my financial ruin while aggressively hiding her own terror. The atmosphere in the living room was thick with toxic gossip. Everyone was whispering about my absence, shaking their heads in mock pity, and telling my parents how incredibly brave they were for holding the family together during such a difficult emotional time. Once everyone had a glass of cheap wine in their hands, my father Richard decided it was time for the main event. He stood in the center of the living room and tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass, commanding the attention of the entire crowd. He gave a highly emotional speech about the importance of family loyalty and unconditional love. He actually squeezed out a few fake tears when he mentioned my name, saying he was praying for my financial recovery. But the fake pity did not last long. Richard quickly pivoted the conversation to his golden child. He placed a proud hand on Derek's shoulder and completely changed the energy in the room. He loudly announced to all of our relatives that despite the heartbreak I had caused them, the family had a massive reason to celebrate tonight. Richard confidently declared that Derek's software startup was just weeks away from a massive initial public offering. He stood right there in the living room of a house he no longer owned, with federal investigators actively digging through his frozen bank accounts, and boldly lied to the faces of everyone he knew. Derek stepped up perfectly, playing his part in the grand illusion. He puffed out his chest and spoke with the smooth, practiced arrogance of a successful technology executive. He told his aunts and uncles fabricated stories about high-level meetings with billionaire investors and massive corporate buyouts. He boasted that his app was about to revolutionize the tech industry and that the family was about to be elevated to an entirely new level of generational wealth. He promised to buy my parents a massive new estate, completely covering up the fact that I had just served them a 30-day eviction notice. The relatives gasped and clapped, completely mesmerized by the fantasy Derek was spinning. They raised their glasses and offered enthusiastic toasts to the golden child, praising his incredible work ethic and his brilliant mind. My parents beamed with absolute pride, soaking up the admiration and the validation they so desperately craved. They felt incredibly powerful, standing in the center of their adoring family, completely convinced that their lies were impenetrable. They thought they had successfully rewritten reality to make themselves the ultimate victors, and me the ultimate loser. But while they were busy clinking glasses and celebrating their imaginary millions, the clock on the living room wall was steadily ticking closer and closer to 7 o'clock in the evening. They were so consumed by their own arrogance that they completely forgot how the real world actually operated. They were entirely oblivious to the massive media machine that was quietly revving up in the background. Down in Malibu, the sun was beginning to set over the Pacific Ocean, casting a brilliant golden light across the cliffside estate. The celebrities, the tech moguls, and the billionaire executives were taking their seats around the transparent glass aisle. The dozens of high-definition network television cameras were rolling, capturing every single breathtaking angle of the multi-million-dollar production. And back in the crowded suburban living room, as the fake celebration reached its absolute peak, my Aunt Susan walked over to the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall. She grabbed the remote control, stating that she wanted to put on a premier lifestyle network in the background for some ambient noise while they ate dessert. She pressed the power button, completely unaware that she was about to pull the pin on a massive digital grenade that would instantly vaporize my family's entire universe. The clock struck exactly 7 on Saturday evening. At that precise moment, two completely opposite realities were unfolding parallel to one another. In a cramped, heavily mortgaged suburban living room, my parents were actively bathing in their own toxic delusions, surrounded by relatives and cheap-boxed wine. But miles away, on the rugged, breathtaking cliffs of the Pacific coast, a massive multi-million-dollar television production was about to broadcast the absolute undeniable truth to over 10 million viewers across the country. The ocean breeze was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt water and the thousands of rare white orchids my agency had flown in just for the occasion. The massive broadcasting trucks were hidden discreetly behind the stone security walls of the billionaire's $60 million Malibu estate. Inside the mobile control room, the network director stared at the monitor banks and began the final countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And just like that, the highly anticipated season finale of the nation's premier luxury lifestyle docuseries went completely live to the entire world. For the millions of viewers watching from their living rooms, the broadcast opened with a truly spectacular aerial drone shot. The high-definition camera swept high over the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean, moving rapidly toward the dramatic cliffside. The sheer scale and opulence of the architectural masterpiece was finally revealed to the public eye. The modern glass and steel mansion glowed like a magnificent jewel against the deepening vibrant oranges and purples of the California sunset. The camera smoothly transitioned down to the main terrace where my elite production team had literally pulled off the impossible. The Olympic-sized infinity pool, which seemed to drop straight off the edge of the cliff directly into the ocean below, had been completely transformed. We had engineered a massive, completely transparent custom glass aisle suspended directly over the water. It created a breathtaking optical illusion, making it look as though the bridal procession would be walking right on the surface of the glowing blue water. Thousands of pristine white orchids cascaded down the sleek minimalist walls of the estate, creating a surreal modern fairy tale aesthetic that easily justified every single penny of the network's massive production budget. The live cameras then panned across the sprawling reception area, capturing the incredibly exclusive guest list mingling over crystal glasses of vintage champagne. This was not the fake borrowed lifestyle that Simone desperately tried to project on her social media channels. This was actual, undeniable elite wealth and true corporate power. There were no desperate influencers staging fake photos here. Instead, the cameras caught clear glimpses of highly recognizable, A-list Hollywood actors chatting casually with Wall Street executives and prominent venture capitalists. Tech billionaires stood near the edge of the terrace, admiring the structural design of the property. The three Michelin star catering team moved silently and efficiently through the elegant crowd, offering delicate coastal appetizers on polished silver platters. As the camera moved through the crowd, the network announcer provided a smooth, highly professional voiceover, formally introducing the viewers to the bride. The announcer did not call me a broke sister or a struggling party planner. The broadcast clearly stated my full name and introduced me as the founder and chief executive officer of the nation's most elite luxury event production agency. They highlighted my massive corporate empire, my high-profile billionaire clientele, and my absolute dominance in a highly competitive industry. Backstage inside the sprawling master suite of the estate, I took one final deep breath and looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The $40,000 custom French lace gown fit me with absolute perfection. The heavy silk train pooled beautifully at my feet, and the intricate crystal beading caught the warm ambient light of the room. I felt completely calm, grounded, and incredibly powerful. I had spent my entire life being told to make myself smaller so my golden child brother could shine. I had spent 3 decades absorbing the cruel insults of my mother and the aggressive financial abuse of my father. But looking at my reflection in the mirror, I knew with absolute certainty that the helpless scapegoat they had tried to bury was permanently gone. I stepped out of the suite and made my way toward the grand terrace. The live string quartet positioned near the water began playing a soaring modern symphony that echoed beautifully against the cliffs. The heavy glass doors opened and I stepped out onto the transparent aisle. The collective gasp from the elite crowd was genuine and clearly picked up by the broadcast microphones. As I walked out over the glowing blue water of the infinity pool, the setting sun illuminated the entire venue, casting a warm golden glow over everything. At the end of the glass aisle, standing tall and incredibly proud, was Nolan. He looked striking in his tailored tuxedo, his eyes fixed entirely on me, reflecting the deep, unwavering respect and love he had always shown me. I took my time walking down the breathtaking aisle, feeling the gentle ocean breeze lifting the delicate edges of my veil. Every single step I took felt like a definitive permanent break from my toxic past. I was walking toward a future built entirely on my own hard work, my own strict boundaries, and my own carefully chosen family. The television cameras captured every single angle of the flawless ceremony, broadcasting the undeniable reality of my success directly into millions of living rooms across the nation. I reached the altar and Nolan took my hands in his, giving them a firm, reassuring squeeze. The officiant began the ceremony speaking beautifully about equal partnership and mutual respect. The entire scene was picture perfect, radiating a level of true luxury and genuine happiness that could never be faked or borrowed. While I was standing over the Pacific Ocean exchanging vows with the man who actually supported me, my Aunt Susan was sitting on the lumpy fabric sofa in my parents' crowded suburban living room. The spiteful family healing dinner had reached a dull lull. Derek had completely finished bragging about his fabricated software company, and the relatives were busy eating slices of a cheap grocery store sheet cake off of paper plates. My mother Brenda was holding court in the corner, still playing the brave, heartbroken matriarch for anyone who would listen to her lies. Susan, feeling slightly bored by the repetitive complaints, decided she wanted some ambient noise. She picked up the television remote from the scratched coffee table and pointed it at the large flat screen mounted on the living room wall. She hit the power button and began absent-mindedly flipping through the channels looking for a pleasant home improvement show or a cooking program. She pressed the channel up button one more time, and the screen suddenly flashed bright with the brilliant colors of a Malibu sunset. Susan stopped chewing her cake. The entire living room was suddenly filled with the smooth, professional voice of the television announcer describing an exclusive billionaire estate. Susan squinted at the high-definition screen, trying to process the incredibly familiar face, wearing a $40,000 gown, walking down a massive glass aisle on national television. Aunt Susan stood frozen with the television remote pointing directly at the large flat screen mounted on the living room wall. The cheap grocery store cake she had been eating was completely forgotten on the coffee table. The entire crowded room, which just moments ago had been buzzing with toxic gossip and fake pity, suddenly plunged into an absolute dead silence. Every single relative turned their head to stare at the glowing high-definition screen. The broadcast showed a sweeping aerial view of the breathtaking $60 million cliffside estate in Malibu. The vibrant colors of the California sunset reflected off the massive infinity pool and the transparent custom glass aisle. And right there in the center of the screen, walking gracefully over the water in a $40,000 designer gown, was me. I looked absolutely radiant, glowing with genuine happiness and undeniable power. The smooth, highly professional voice of the network television announcer filled the cramped suburban living room, echoing off the cheap walls. The announcer formally introduced me to the millions of viewers watching nationwide. He did not describe a broke party planner begging for handouts. He spoke with deep reverence, detailing my massive corporate empire and my flawless reputation in the industry. He officially crowned me as America's premier luxury event mogul. He talked about my elite billionaire clientele, the massive production budgets I commanded, and the unparalleled creativity of my agency. The announcer highlighted how my wedding was the ultimate showcase of my professional dominance, a multi-million-dollar production entirely funded by the network to honor my incredible success. Every single word spoken on that broadcast acted like a heavy sledgehammer systematically smashing through the massive wall of lies my parents had built. My father, Richard, was standing near the makeshift buffet table, holding a crystal glass of cheap red wine. As the television announcer listed my staggering corporate achievements, all the color completely drained from Richard's face. His hand began to tremble violently. His fingers suddenly went entirely limp, and the crystal glass slipped from his grasp. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud, sharp crack, shattering into dozens of pieces and sending a splash of dark red wine across the floorboards. But nobody moved to clean it up. Nobody even blinked. My mother, Brenda, was sitting stiffly on the couch, looking as if she had just been struck by lightning. Her mouth was slightly open, and her eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated horror. She stared at the television screen, watching the daughter she had ruthlessly bullied and underestimated her entire life being celebrated as royalty on national television. The sheer opulence of the event, the A-list celebrities mingling in the background, and the undeniable reality of my absolute wealth completely paralyzed her. The extended relatives who had spent the entire evening listening to my parents complain about my supposed financial ruin slowly turned their heads away from the television and looked directly at Derek. The golden child was standing completely frozen in the center of the room. Just 10 minutes ago, he had been boasting to everyone about his fake upcoming initial public offering and mocking my supposed public beach wedding. Now the absolute truth was staring them all right in the face. Derek had lied. My parents had lied. I was not the broke failure they claimed I was. I was a highly successful self-made mogul, and they were the ones living in a delusional fantasy. The relatives' eyes filled with sudden intense judgment and deep suspicion, realizing they had been manipulated into participating in a cruel, spiteful charade. Derek could feel the crushing weight of their stares, but he could not tear his eyes away from the television screen. His breathing became shallow and rapid as the live broadcast panned across the sprawling outdoor reception area. The high-definition camera zoomed in on a group of elite VIP guests standing near the edge of the terrace, sipping vintage champagne and laughing comfortably. Derek's eyes darted wildly across the screen as he recognized the faces in the crowd. Standing right there at my wedding, having the time of their lives, were the exact same high-profile venture capitalists and prominent tech investors who had funded his startup. They were the very same powerful men who had just frozen his bank accounts and demanded a full forensic audit of his fraudulent company. Derek watched the men he desperately needed to impress casually attending the wedding of the sister he had just publicly humiliated. The realization that I commanded the respect of the billionaires who held his entire fate in their hands completely shattered his fragile ego. Something dark and chaotic finally snapped inside his mind, pushing him completely over the edge of reason. Derek stared at the high-definition television screen in his parents' living room, his mind unraveling. The sight of the prominent venture capitalist sipping champagne at my wedding shattered his fragile grip on reality. In his twisted brain, he did not see my wedding as a celebration of my hard work. He saw it as a networking event designed to save his crumbling fake software empire. He convinced himself that if he could just get inside that estate and corner those billionaire investors in person, he could secure the funding he needed and avoid federal prison. He turned away from the television maniac and started screaming at my parents, telling them to drop their plates and grab their car keys immediately. Brenda and Richard were still trapped in absolute shock, but Derek's frantic shouting snapped them out of their paralysis. Without saying a word of apology to the dozens of extended relatives sitting in their living room, my parents abandoned their spiteful family healing dinner. They left their guests surrounded by half-eaten desserts and ran out the front door. Derek shoved his way into the passenger seat of Richard's car, typing the coordinates of the Malibu coastline into his phone. Richard slammed his foot on the gas, speeding out of the neighborhood and merging recklessly onto the highway. The drive was filled with chaotic panic. Derek was sweating profusely, practicing his elevator pitch, while Brenda sat in the back crying hysterically about how I had intentionally humiliated her on national television. They drove for over an hour, winding up the treacherous coastal canyon roads. When they finally reached the address, they did not find a welcoming reception. The billionaire estate was heavily fortified, hidden behind massive wrought iron gates and thick stone walls. Positioned directly in front of the entrance were half a dozen elite private security contractors, wearing crisp black suits. Derek jumped out of the car before Richard even put the vehicle in park. He adjusted his wrinkled collar and marched aggressively toward the gates, projecting the fake arrogance he always used. He approached the lead guard and demanded immediate entry. He puffed out his chest, announcing that he was the brother of the bride and had highly important corporate business to discuss with the VIP guests inside. The security guard did not blink. He held up a digital tablet displaying the heavily vetted guest list and asked for identification. When Derek handed over his license, the guard tapped the screen and shook his head. He coldly informed Derek that his name was nowhere on the approved access list and he needed to vacate the driveway immediately. Derek could not handle the rejection. The massive iron gates were the only thing standing between him and financial salvation. He lost his temper, screaming at the top of his lungs and pointing his finger in the guard's face. Richard ran up behind him, attempting to bully the security team by shouting about his rights, as the father of the bride, completely forgetting he had publicly disowned me days prior. But they were not just making a scene in front of private security, because the broadcast was a highly publicized national event. The street outside the estate was lined with aggressive paparazzi and secondary network camera crews. The moment Derek started screaming, a dozen high-intensity camera flashes lit up the dark canyon road. The network cameras instantly swiveled to capture the drama unfolding at the gates. Derek tried to physically push his way past the lead guard lunging toward the iron bars. It was the worst mistake of his life. The elite security team reacted instantly. They grabbed Derek by the shoulders, twisting his arms behind his back with effortless force. They physically escorted him and my red-faced father away from the pristine driveway, shoving them roughly into the dusty dirt embankment. Derek stumbled in the dirt, his expensive clothes covered in dust. He looked up directly into the blinding camera lights, his face contorted in desperate rage. He screamed at the top of his lungs that I was his sister and that I owed him. The paparazzi captured every humiliating second of his meltdown in stunning high definition. My parents stood in the dirt road watching the flashbulbs pop, completely stripped of their dignity and their fake wealthy facade. They thought they were going to crash my wedding and steal my connections, but they only provided the world with the ultimate embarrassing spectacle. The absolute worst part for Derek was that the footage captured outside those gates did not just stay on the cameras. Within minutes, the high-quality video of the brilliant tech founder crying in the dirt hit the internet. The global internet moves with a ruthless speed my family could never comprehend. By the time the sun rose the morning after my Malibu wedding, the high-definition footage of my brother fighting armed security guards had taken over social media. The paparazzi video captured every single pathetic detail of his meltdown. It showed Derek screaming my name covered in dirt, looking completely unhinged outside the heavily fortified gates of the billionaire estate, while my father tried to aggressively bully the stone-faced guards. Because my broadcast had broken viewership records for the television network, the internet was already actively searching for anything related to my name. When the gossip blogs realized the screaming man in the dirt was the brother of the famous event mogul, the video exploded. It trended at #1 nationwide across every single major digital platform. People created side-by-side comparisons, contrasting my breathtaking walk down the transparent glass aisle over the Pacific Ocean with Derek's embarrassing temper tantrum in the dusty canyon road. He had always desperately wanted to be famous and recognized for his supposed brilliance. Now his face was plastered across the entire country. But instead of being hailed as a tech genius, he was universally mocked as a desperate, unhinged fraud who tried to crash his own sister's luxury wedding. The comment sections were filled with millions of strangers brutally dissecting his entire life. The public humiliation was immediate, but the financial destruction that followed was absolute. When Monday morning arrived, the few remaining venture capitalists who had kept Derek's startup barely afloat saw the viral video. They saw the very same man who claimed to be running a revolutionary software company acting like a complete lunatic in the street, combined with the severe banking fraud alerts Nolan had legally triggered. The previous week, the investors completely panicked. They immediately initiated the strict financial clauses in their contracts and officially pulled every single cent of their funding. They demanded an immediate emergency audit of his corporate ledgers to find out exactly where their money had gone. When the independent auditors opened his books, they found exactly what I always knew was there. There was absolutely no revolutionary code. There was no massive user base. The entire company was nothing but a fragile shell game built entirely on borrowed cash and profound arrogance. By Tuesday afternoon, the tech startup was officially declared insolvent and permanently collapsed. Derek's business bank accounts were seized by the federal government, and he was left staring at a mountain of insurmountable corporate debt with absolutely no way to pay it back. His golden child status was entirely vaporized, leaving him exposed to impending federal fraud investigations and massive civil lawsuits from the angry investors he had relentlessly lied to for years. He was completely trapped in a nightmare of his own making. While Derek was drowning in his own catastrophic failure, his wife Simone proved exactly how ruthless her survival instincts truly were. Simone had built her entire digital influencer brand on the aesthetic of extreme wealth and sophistication. When the viral video of her husband screaming in the dirt hit the internet, her carefully curated image began to actively burn to the ground. Brand sponsors started sending her urgent emails threatening to terminate her highly lucrative endorsement contracts. Simone realized that remaining married to a publicly humiliated bankrupt man under active federal investigation would completely destroy her primary source of income and her entire social standing. She did not hesitate to save herself. On Wednesday morning, Simone officially filed for a highly public divorce. But she did not just quietly leave him, she weaponized her massive platform against the man she had sworn to love. She recorded a highly emotional 20-minute video for her 500,000 followers sitting on her bedroom floor in comfortable clothes with carefully smudged makeup. She sobbed directly into the camera, claiming she had been entirely deceived by Derek's elaborate financial lies. She completely exposed his financial ruin, detailing how his startup was a total scam and how his family was deeply toxic and emotionally abusive. She threw Derek and my parents entirely under the bus, using their complete destruction to generate massive sympathy and record-breaking engagement numbers for her own selfish brand. Her follower count skyrocketed, while her husband's life completely disintegrated into ashes. Back in the quiet suburbs, the reality of their ruin finally crashed down onto my parents. Brenda and Richard were sitting in the exact same living room where they had hosted their spiteful fake celebration just a few days prior. The house was completely silent now, devoid of the fake friends and extended relatives who had quickly abandoned them after the true story broke on national television. Because Richard had committed federal wire fraud by using my social security number for that commercial loan, his personal bank accounts remained entirely frozen by the federal authorities. They had absolutely no liquid cash to pay for basic groceries, let alone mount a legal defense for the incoming federal charges. Furthermore, the 30-day eviction notice I had handed them was still actively ticking down like a bomb. With Derek completely bankrupt and facing his own legal nightmare, the golden child they had sacrificed everything for was utterly powerless to help them. Richard and Brenda were completely cornered by the devastating consequences of their own toxic greed. They were forced to make the most humiliating decision of their entire lives. They had to call a real estate agent and formally list their beloved suburban home for a desperate quick cash sale just to cover their legal fees and avoid going to federal prison. As they sat on their expensive sofa, staring at the empty walls, they realized they systematically destroyed their relationship with the only person who possessed the wealth and power to save them from total annihilation. They finally understood they needed me more than they needed oxygen, and they prepared to beg for mercy. 1 week later, the chaotic noise of Los Angeles felt like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. I was reclining on the plush white cushions of a private luxury yacht, gently bobbing in the crystal-clear waters off the Amalfi Coast in Italy. The warm Mediterranean sun kissed my skin, and a soft, salty breeze carried the faint scent of lemon groves from the terraced cliffs above. Nolan was sitting beside me wearing a crisp linen shirt, looking out at the endless expanse of sparkling blue water. We had spent the last 7 days completely disconnected from the outside world, entirely focused on celebrating our new marriage and the massive success of the television broadcast. The network had already sent me the preliminary viewership numbers, and they were absolutely record-breaking. My agency was flooded with new lucrative contracts from elite international clients. Everything I had ever worked for was finally secured. I reached over to the small teakwood table next to my lounge chair and picked up my phone. I had kept it completely turned off since the moment I walked down the glass aisle in Malibu. I pressed the power button and waited for the screen to light up. The absolute second the phone connected to the international cellular network, it began to vibrate violently in my hand. It did not stop buzzing for 3 full minutes. The screen was completely buried under a massive avalanche of urgent notifications. There were over 150 unread text messages, dozens of frantic voicemails, and endless missed calls. They were all from my mother Brenda, my father Richard, and my brother Derek. I slowly unlocked the screen and opened the family group chat. The tone of their messages had undergone a complete and miraculous transformation. There were no more cruel insults. There were no more arrogant demands. There were no more threats of disowning me or cutting me out of the family legacy. Instead, the screen was filled with pathetic, desperate groveling. I scrolled through the massive wall of text reading their frantic words. Brenda had sent dozens of paragraphs crying about how she was so incredibly proud of me and how beautiful my wedding looked on television. She actually typed out the words, "I always knew you were destined for greatness." It was a sickeningly sweet lie that completely ignored the fact that she had personally shredded my wedding invitation just weeks prior. Richard sent long rambling messages begging me to answer the phone. He confessed that the federal bank investigators were closing in on him and that the suburban house was officially going up for a desperate fire sale. He pleaded with me to use my high-powered corporate lawyers to save him from going to federal prison. He called me his brilliant, successful daughter and promised he would do anything to make up for his past mistakes. And then there were the messages from Derek. The golden child was completely broken. His tech startup was officially dead, his investors were suing him into oblivion, and his wife had publicly abandoned him. Derek literally begged me for a financial bailout. He asked me to transfer $200,000 to a secure account to help him flee his creditors. He claimed that because we were blood, I owed it to him to save his life. I sat there on the deck of the luxury yacht reading their desperate pleas, and I realized something incredibly profound. For the first time in my 33 years of life, reading their words did not trigger a single ounce of anxiety in my chest. I did not feel that familiar heavy guilt pulling at my stomach. I did not feel the sudden urgent need to fix their problems or sacrifice my own happiness to buy their conditional love. Looking at those frantic messages, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calm closure. They were not my family. They were just toxic strangers who had systematically tried to destroy me and then came crawling back the absolute second they realized I possessed the power and the wealth they so desperately craved. They had made their choices. They had chosen to commit federal crimes rather than simply treat me with basic human respect. I did not type out a long emotional response. I did not demand an apology or explain how much they had hurt me over the years because they simply did not deserve my energy anymore. I reached over and picked up my crystal flute of vintage Italian champagne. I took a slow, refreshing sip, letting the cold bubbles dance on my tongue. I set the glass down and tapped the screen of my phone, bringing up the keyboard. I typed just 2 simple words into the family group chat. Too late. I hit send and watched the message deliver to the 3 of them. I did not wait to see the typing bubbles appear. I did not care what their reaction would be. I stood up from my lounge chair and walked over to the polished wooden railing of the yacht. I looked down into the deep, magnificent blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea. Without a single second of hesitation, I opened my hand and let the phone slip through my fingers. I watched it fall, disappearing silently into the deep water, taking all of their toxic chaos, all of their demands, and all of their desperate lies down to the bottom of the sea. I turned around and walked back to Nolan. He looked up at me with a warm, knowing smile and held out his hand. I took his hand feeling completely light, entirely free, and ready to truly begin my beautiful, authentic life. The sun shone brightly, warming my soul forever. The most profound lesson to take away from this journey is that shared DNA does not grant anyone the automatic right to disrespect, abuse, or financially exploit you. For years, you may have been conditioned to believe that you must constantly sacrifice your own happiness, boundaries, and hard-earned success to keep the peace within a toxic family dynamic. But true peace is never found by shrinking yourself to accommodate the massive egos of manipulative people. It is found when you realize your own worth and establish ironclad boundaries that protect your peace of mind. Your success is not community property for those who mocked your struggles. You are allowed to walk away from people who only see your value when they need something from you. The greatest revenge is not lowering yourself to their level of hostility. The greatest revenge is building a beautiful, wildly successful life entirely on your own terms, and refusing to let those who doubted you have a front row seat to your victory. Remember that family is not just about the blood you were born into, it is about the genuine, supportive, and loving circle you actively choose to create around yourself as an adult. Have you ever had to establish firm boundaries with toxic family members who tried to take advantage of your success? How did you find the incredible strength to finally walk away and protect your own peace? I would absolutely love to read your inspiring stories of resilience and personal growth in the comments section below. If this story resonated with your own journey, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more empowering stories of triumph over adversity. Share this video with someone who might desperately need a reminder of their own worth today.